Hi everyone, today's lesson is over chapter 6, which is about pre-algebra. We're going to talk about sign numbers, and as you can see I have a number line up here showing sign numbers, and so far we've worked with these numbers, right, 0 and on to the positive numbers, but now we're going to begin including some negative numbers on here. So that starts with -1, -2, -3, -4, and so on. You can see the positioning on the number line. All right, and then we're going to talk about absolute value. And the reason we talk about absolute value is because one of the definitions, or some of the definitions, include absolute value if you look at like the official way to add and subtract positive and negative numbers. And so then we talk about absolute value, or even multiplying and dividing, I believe it will talk about absolute value. Absolute value is the distance from 0 on a number line. So as you can see here, these bars mean the absolute value of -3. So when you see these symbols, that's what that means. Absolute value of -3 would be +3. The absolute value of 0, of course, is 0. Absolute value of 5 is 5, and that's because of distance, right? 0 has no distance from 0. 5 has a distance of 5. -3 has the distance of -3. All right, and so you'll see some about absolute value and some of my definitions. On your calculators, when you're working with negative numbers, you have to be careful, because if you're putting a number in as a negative, you have to use the negative key and not the minus key. Now sometimes you do use the minus key, like if you're entering -3 minus 5, then of course you would use the minus key for between the -3 and the 5, but you would use the negative key on the 3. So if I put something like this, -3 minus 5, this would be the negative key, but this would be the minus. So you just have to learn how to use the key. On some calculators, like this one on the right, you have to put the number on the screen and then push your negative to make it negative. On the one on the left, you would just push the negative key and then a 3 if you want a -3 on your screen. It is important to make sure you can use your calculator properly. Something that I find in this class is that you forget about where some things are located sometimes, or then when you're calculating something, you actually are calculating it incorrectly because order of operations comes into play and those kind of things. So you always want to really practice, can you get this calculated correctly? And that in this chapter and in chapter 7 both, we have some pretty interesting things that you're going to be calculating, and so you want to be careful with that. Now on this one, addition of signed numbers, if we have two numbers that are both negative, then we basically add the numbers together and the sign of the answer is based on what we were adding. So I have 3 negatives and 4 negatives, which gives me a total of -7. If they're positive, of course, same rules apply that has always applied. And then when we're subtracting or when we're adding and we're using the definition, right, you subtract and use the sign of the larger absolute number when you have a different sign. I got all tongue-tied on that one. Okay, so we're adding these numbers. One has a negative, one has a positive, and this is how you do that, right? You use the sign of the number with the largest absolute value. So in this case, that would be the 5. So we have 2 positives. Or on the second case, it would be the -7. So we end up with a -4. I like to just say this: do I have more negatives or positives? So in the case of this first one, I had more positives. On the second one, I had more negatives. And how many more? Of course, there is subtraction involved, but sometimes it's easier just to think about it this way. Oh, I have 4 more negatives than positives, so I have a -4 answer. Now, when you're adding up numbers, of course, you can just put these on your calculator, right? I know that you can, and you can just enter this, but sometimes it's helpful to be able to just look at these numbers and work with it a little bit without using your calculators. And I would encourage you to do that just to get the rules down so that you don't have to always put something on your calculator to figure something out. What I like to do is add my negatives. right? So if I add 19 and 21, you can actually do that on your calculator without even putting the negatives on there. 19 and 21 have a total of 40, so I have negative 40 plus, then I'm going to add my positives, and on my positives I get a 37. And now I can apply the different sign way of addition, or just the fact that I have more negatives than positives, and I have 3 more negatives than I do positives. I know this is kind of maybe an elementary way to look at it, but I swear to you it's the easiest way to think about it. It works. You don't have to think about this big definition about absolute value. On the second one, let's add up the negatives. So we have negative 36, negative 18, and negative 5. And that gives me a total of negative 59 for the negatives. And then my positives are 45 and 27. And that is 72. And now this you could enter in your calculator, but I mean, you could enter the whole thing if you want to, but once again, you know, you've got all these negative signs to put in there. And this is 13 because I have more positives than I do negatives. So my answer is the difference of the two with a positive for my answer. Now, what about when we subtract? So when we subtract, we can always change this to adding the opposite. And you don't necessarily have to do this, but you want to do this in some cases to make sure that you don't mess up your signs. And this is how we would rewrite. So negative 3 minus 4 is negative 3 plus negative 4. And that actually is negative 7. And on the next one, I have negative 3 minus negative 7. So if I add the opposite, I'm adding the opposite of negative 7, which is positive 7. And this would be a 1. And then on the next one, minus negative 10 becomes plus 10, so that is 15. All right, so on the next one, if I rewrite it, I like you to just practice the rewriting sometimes just to help you think about what's happening. That's negative 45 plus negative 67. Once again, you can put the two numbers on your calculator without using negatives, because I would like you to realize, oh, this is going to be a negative answer. Right, so I get negative 112 when I add 45 and 67. I know it's negative because both numbers are negative and I'm adding them. On the next one, if I rewrite it, and this one's even more important because it becomes a plus. And when we start solving equations in chapter 7, you don't want a double negative in an equation anywhere. You always want to make that a positive. So this is really negative 27 plus 16. And that would give me negative 11 when I take 27 minus 16. And then, of course, I have more negatives than positives. Or the number with the biggest or the largest absolute value would be the 27. So my answer is negative. Now, this sign thing is a big deal. Students lose a lot of points because of signs sometimes, so that's why you want to learn this and be careful with it. Now, I like the rules for multiplication and division because they're just easy. And the thing is, you don't want to get these confused when you're with adding and subtracting, so you just have to practice and make sure you know how these work. Of course, you can always double check with your calculator, because you get to use calculators for everything. All right, so if I have the same sign, right, they're both negative or they're both positive, then my answer is positive. If I have different signs, right, one's positive, one's negative, then I get a negative whether I'm multiplying or dividing. So you can see my little examples there. So on number 5, you should say to yourself, is this going to be negative or positive? And you can make that decision before you even put it on your calculator. It will be positive. It's 3.86 and the 6 is repeating. So if we're rounding to the hundredths place, it's going to be 3.87. Now on the next one, we have multiplication and division, and we have 3 negatives. So there is this rule that says if you have an odd number of negatives, this is when you are anytime you're multiplying or dividing, if you have an odd number of negatives, then you're going to end up with a negative answer. And if you have an even number of negatives, you would end up with a positive answer. Now, most of the time, that would just be when we were talking about multiplication. But in this case, as you can see, we're multiplying and dividing, because usually with division, you only divide once. You don't have it twice anyway. And so if we put this on our calculator, once again, you decide on the sign first, and then you can calculate the rest of it. Of course, on this, we're going to calculate this part first because order of operations says we divide. So basically, if we go left to right on this, we'll be fine. It's negative 214.7, and if we're rounding it to the nearest integer, it would be negative 215. All right, rounding rules still apply, right? This number tells me what to do with the 4, right, to round it to an integer. All right, now we're going to talk about some exponents, and so we are going to be adding to our order of operations in this chapter because now we're going to have some exponents and possibly some other operations. It's important to know how this works on your calculator. So if you put negative 4 squared on your calculator, it will give you a negative 16. Because that's basically 4 times 4. We're not saying both of the 4's are negative in that case, so that gives negative 16. But if we have a parentheses, that is telling me I'm taking negative 4 times negative 4, so it's a positive 16. Practice this with your calculators. There are actually some calculators who don't do this right, so you need to know what happens without parentheses, what happens with parentheses. Now this only applies to even exponents, because with odd exponents we don't have that problem. If on number 7, for instance, I could put this in without parentheses or with parentheses, and I still get negative 32. Now on some calculators you will have this key, and so you can put, if you have it like on the ones we recommend for this class, it's negative 2. We push this caret key is what I call it, and put in your 5 equals, and you get negative 32. Some calculators will have x to the y or y to the x keys, and that would be your exponent key. You might just have to practice with it a little bit, but usually you would put in, like, if it's y to the x, negative 2, and then this key, and 5, and then your equals key. Let me go back to my calculator pictures here for a minute. So in this one, yeah, this one's a y to the x if you happen to have that model. And you do have to practice with that because this one does things a little bit differently. So just experiment with it to see. I believe you put in your base number first and then press that key and put in your exponent. All right, let's get back to where we were. Oh, I passed it. Okay, there we are. So on this one, we did end up with negative 32. On the next one, you would subtract first, so you get a positive 6. We don't need parentheses on positive numbers, but if that had been negative, you would definitely keep the parentheses on to calculate it, and it is 36. All right, I want to see. We don't have a lot of time left here. I think we can maybe do these two. All right, so these are order of operations. Order of operations says that we are going to clear parentheses first if we have any. Next comes exponents, and so we would do exponents and then go from there. And we previously learned those, right? Multiplication, division, left to right, and so on. And so on this first one, we would calculate, we can do both of our exponents. So 6 squared is 36. And 4 to the third is 64. Then next step is multiply. Okay, so that's 180 minus 64 and 116. I always want you practicing some of the steps because that helps you learn this, not just keying it into your calculator, because you really need to have a general understanding of this. On the next one, we have 64 divided by 4 squared is 16. We calculate this next, and that's 4 plus 18, so we end up with 22. This is where we're going to stop the video, and then I'll start the rest, more of the lesson on the next video. I don't know if it'll take 2 or 3. Bye, everyone.